This is the Plague Doctor mask, a piece that's as functional as it was creepy. The iconic beak was filled with flowers, tobacco, herbs, anything that smelled better than the corpses being peeled off the street nearby. And 14th century physicians were so worried about smell because they believed that disease spread through poisonous, putrid air that could make you sick, what we call miasma. The smell of rotting corpses wasn't a sign of disease, it was disease. Miasma theory lasted for a long time, despite plenty of evidence that it might not be true. So today, we're going to learn how miasma theory became a thing, why it stayed around for so long, and how it brought us to the edge of modern medicine. But first we have to ask, how does an epidemic spread? If you asked this question in 500 BCE, the most common explanation was that something about the air was causing disease. And while this idea eventually became known as miasma theory, the word miasma doesn't actually show up in the dictionary until the 1600s. And there's no single moment we can point to as the origin of miasma. Multiple cultures thought of variations of it throughout time since it was so intuitive. People would notice that disease tended to cluster around bad-smelling stuff like corpses, trash, or livestock. And the only thing that all the victims of the epidemic had in common was that they were exposed to the same bad-smelling air, so the disease must have been caused by something in the air. That's actually how the disease malaria got its name. It comes from the Italian word for bad air. Malaria. Miasma theory got its initial bump from Hippocrates and his students. They believed that disease came from an imbalance in the four bodily fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each of which had different properties. I already made a video about this system, which you can find here, but the Hippocratics believed that literally every physical thing had some variation of these properties, which meant that a change in your environment could affect your individual humors. And a change in everyone's environment, like the kind of changes that happen with the seasons, affects everyone's humors at the same time. At a big enough scale, that's an epidemic. In On Airs, Waters, and Places, a Hippocratic author writes, "Whoever wishes to investigate medicine properly should proceed thus. In the first place, to consider the seasons of the year, and what effects each of them produces, for they are not all alike, but differ much from themselves in regards to their changes." Kind of like how we have allergy season and flu season, Hippocrates would have described diarrhea season. The author spends the rest of the treatise describing different regions' seasonal maladies. So Hippocrates popularized the whole miasma thing, and a few hundred years later, a Roman architect named Vitruvius used miasma theory as a kind of health code for other architects. In De Architectura, he says to pick a very healthy site. Such a site will be high, neither misty nor frosty, and in a climate neither hot nor cold, but temperate. Further, without marshes in the neighborhood. For when the morning breezes blow toward the town at sunrise, if they bring with them mists from marshes, and mingled with the mist, the poisonous breath of the creatures of the marshes to be wafted into the bodies of the inhabitants, they will make the site unhealthy. Sounds a lot like our modern understanding of malaria. While the Greeks and Romans used miasma in the context of the four humors, other medical systems had their own versions of miasma. It started showing up in the traditional Chinese medicine textbooks by the 5th and 6th century and was thought to cause a bunch of different diseases like dysentery or the flu. And over in India, Ayurvedic physicians ascribed epidemics to changes in the environment just like Hippocrates. Their community shared the same space, so a change in environment affected everyone's health. That might be through seasonal changes or polluted air like in the traditional miasma theory, or through changes to the water or land. But while miasma theory was the most popular explanation for epidemics, it wasn't the only explanation. The idea that disease could spread directly from person to person has been around just as long as miasma. It was called contagion. Back in the 6th century BCE in India, the famous Ayurvedic surgeon Sushruta proposed that diseases like leprosy, fever, and some eye diseases could be spread from person to person through sex, touch, or sharing clothing. Then, in the 2nd century CE, the famous Roman physician Claudius Galen noticed that when people spent a lot of time with plague victims, they tended to get it too. Galen proposed that these diseases were spread through semina, or seeds of disease. By the time of the first plague epidemic in the 6th century CE, a historian named Scholasticus, which is a great name for a historian, proposed that plague might also be transmitted through person-to-person contact. Fast forward to the 10th century, and Islamic scholars, including the famous Ibn Sina, subscribed to both miasma theory and contagion theory. And these hybrid theories weren't unheard of. There was no single model that every doctor used to explain disease. Plus, miasma theory wasn't well defined. Depending on who you asked, it was anything from a literal cloud of poison to a more abstract method of disease delivery. But very importantly, miasma was not alive. Like, even if Galen's seeds of disease putrefied in the body and caused disease that way, he didn't think they were alive in the same way that we understand bacteria to be alive today. Now, once we get to the Middle Ages, we started seeing epidemics more frequently, especially around dense cities with lots of opportunities for disease transmission. This was especially clear in the 14th century, when the Black Death was ripping through Europe. In April 1348, Jaume d'Agremont wrote the earliest documented account of the epidemic and made it clear that he thought plague came from miasma. After shouting out the air quality of my ancestral homeland, he describes how air can be altered and putrefy, and how it can change your humors. Remember, at this point, physicians were still using the old-school humoral system, and these terms, phlegmatics, cholerics, sanguinics, and others continually sad, are references to temperaments based on the humors. Then he moves on to define plague, or what he called pestilence. I maintain that pestilence is a contranatural change of the air in its qualities or in its substance, from which arise in living things corruptions and sudden deaths and various maladies in certain determined regions beyond their ordinary. Some of his treatments were equally as miasmatic. The common folk may use the following regimen. They can make fire in their huts and in their chambers of rosemary and juniper, and make fumigations of incense and myrrh or other things cheaply to be had, such as simiyama or herb of thur. And I will say that the fire alone can effectively rectify air putrid in its substance. What he didn't recommend was any kind of public cleanup campaign, since he was afraid that moving the filth around would actually spread disease by moving the source of miasma from one place to another. Later that year, physicians at the University of Paris explained the plague by saying, "The present epidemic, or pest, comes directly from air corrupted in its substance, and recommends covering up the smell with things that smell good." This is where those plague doctors come back in. The good-smelling stuff in the beaks counteracted miasmas. Over in Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio describes the same thing. They went around carrying in their hands flowers or sweet-smelling herbs or various kinds of spices, and they would often put these things to their noses, believing that such smells were a wonderful means of purifying the brain, for all the air seemed infected with the stench of dead bodies, sickness, and medicines. Aside from home remedies, there were also public fires, fumigation torches, perfume if you were rich, or you could just smoke a tobacco pipe. Obviously, this is before we knew it caused cancer, a story that you can learn all about in this video. When the Black Death came to Spain, an Arabic physician named Ibn Qatima used the humoral miasma model as well, tying plague back to bad air. In his 1359 work, he says, "The immediate cause of plague is usually the corruption of the air, which surrounds people and which people inhale. It consists in that corrupted and putrefied vapors emanate from swamps, ditches, and stagnant and non-ventilated weeds, as well as from plants and vegetables spoiled, garbage and debris of people, carrion and dead animals, etc. And all this generates putrid emanations due to which the air is altered and corrupted, giving rise to the plague epidemic." But Ibn Qatima was also one of those scholars who used a hybrid model of miasma theory. In that same book from 1359, he leans more contagionist at times and says, "It becomes clear to anyone who has diagnosed or treated the disease that most of the individuals who have had contact with a plague victim will die, whereas the man who has had no exposure will remain healthy." I'm giving you so many examples here to make it clear that scholars during the Black Death overwhelmingly thought the plague was caused by miasma. There may have been inklings of contagion theory, but by the 14th century, miasma theory was king. After that, you know how the story goes. A few years go by and the Black Death kills 25 million people, so governments and physicians have to figure out what to do. The UK's best effort was passing a law that required people to keep animal waste out of the streets because that would reduce miasmas and prevent another plague. It did not. London had multiple additional plague outbreaks over the next few centuries, including one that killed 100,000 people in the mid-1600s. But if there's a silver lining to this story, all these epidemics allowed scientists to study infectious diseases like never before, and ultimately get us closer to a more accurate theory of disease. And the unlikely hero was an epidemic of a brand new sexually transmitted infection. In 1495, a mysterious new epidemic disease was recorded in Naples, Italy, before quickly spreading throughout the rest of Europe. The disease left its victims with visible skin lesions, which became highly stigmatized, since it was pretty soon clear that this disease was sexually transmitted. Rumors started flying around that it spread thanks to French troops fighting in Italy at the time, earning this new disease the nickname the French disease. A few years later, an Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro started studying epidemics, including this new French disease. But instead of writing a dry expose about it, he wrote the symptoms and clinical presentation into an epic poem. In the poem, the story's protagonist pisses off the god Apollo, who punishes him with the French disease. Here's how Fracastoro tells it. "The sun went pallid for his righteous wrath, and germinated poisons in our path. And he who wrought this outrage was the first to feel his body ache when sore accursed, and for his ulcers and their torturing, no longer would a tossing hard couch bring him sleep, with joints apart and flesh erased. Thus was the shepherd flailed and thus debased, and after him this malady we call syphilis, tearing at our city's wall, to bring with it such ruin and such a wrack, that even the king escaped not its attack. I love this. Like, imagine any modern disease getting this level of artistry. Fracastoro literally named a disease based on his own fictional character. He titled the poem Syphilis sive de morbo gallico, which translates to something like syphilis, the French disease. This popularized a centuries-long tradition of naming syphilis after whichever country you were fighting. Syphilis has been called everything from the French disease to the Italian disease or the German disease. It just depended on who was describing it. And Fracastoro stayed especially interested in syphilis for the rest of his career. See, syphilis was one of a handful of diseases where you did not need miasma theory to understand how it spread. Same thing with rabies. A rabid dog bit you and now you were the one acting rabid. So in 1546, he published De Contagion, where he published a new theory of disease transmission, the first formal contagion theory. In it, he describes three main routes of transmission. The first route included diseases spread from person to person through the air. This was for diseases like tuberculosis or smallpox. Second were the diseases spread through direct touch, like syphilis or gonorrhea. And finally, he proposed that an infected person could touch a thing, what he called a foam, then a healthy person could get sick if they came into contact with that thing. We actually still use this idea of fomite transmission today. It's why we spent April of 2020 wiping down our groceries. But no matter how you were exposed to the disease, Fracastoro proposed that little seeds spread from person to person and ultimately caused the disease in their own specific way. These seeds weren't germs like how we know them today. They were more like chemicals that spread throughout the body. But each seed of disease was different. Some were breathed into the lungs and sucked the life force out of you, while some got into the blood vessels and spread around through the circulatory system. Obviously, the biology of the seeds was a little shaky, but it was okay because it fit within the accepted humoral theory of disease. Like, Fracastoro proposed that syphilis exerted its effects by attaching to your phlegm humor. He also repeated some of those humoral ideas we heard from the ancient Greeks and Romans, like some diseases come and go with the seasons, while some are endemic to an area. Like, he thought that syphilis was endemic to Hispaniola because it had a favorable climate. But Fracastoro didn't offer a ton of practical advice. In De Contagione, he proposes a few treatment strategies, but doesn't spend a ton of time on them. Like, he thought you might be able to use a powder or a chemical to dry out your body and prevent the seed of disease from putrefying, and in some severe cases, you might use pharmaceuticals or surgery, but he didn't give a ton of firm recommendations. He was more concerned with proposing his new theory and giving a framework of recommendations for future research. But this new theory didn't really change medicine. Not right away. This version of contagion theory fit in well with the humoral and miasma theories, which is why it wasn't dismissed out of hand, but he was just spouting off ideas. He wasn't supporting his ideas with evidence. So miasma theory stayed the most popular theory throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. But physicians around Europe would have at least been familiar with Fracastoro's version of contagion theory. Now, neither Fracastoro nor contagionists before him actually saw the seeds of disease he hypothesized. But the thing is, there were microscopes, but they were just barely starting to get good. And starting in the 1600s, a couple of big players blew the doors open for microscopy. Especially these two guys who you probably learned about in school, Anthony van Leeuwenhoek and Robert Hooke. Van Leeuwenhoek was a Dutchman who made hundreds of lenses, including some high-quality microscope lenses that could magnify up to 275 times, and he used them to look at everything. He's most famous for looking at pond water under a microscope, seeing a bunch of little dudes under the lens, and calling them animalcules, for little animals. And this was revolutionary because it gave future scientists the language for talking about microbes. They were like animals, but real tiny, which meant that they were living things. But this is my favorite story, and it's PG-13, so if there's kids watching, get out of here. One night, Van Leeuwenhoek was having sex with his wife, and afterwards looked at his microscope across the room and asked the obvious follow-up question. That night, he became the first person to see sperm under a microscope. And to his credit, he was also the first scientist to see bacteria under a microscope, but obviously, the sperm story is funnier. Our second character is England's Robert Hooke, who was interested in a bunch of different sciences, and published a book called Micrographia in 1665. And this thing is rad. It's basically a picture book of a bunch of stuff that Hooke looked at under the microscope, complete with stories of his observations. And I gotta tell you the story about this ant picture. To quote Hooke himself, "This was a creature more troublesome to be drawn than any of the rest, for I could not, for a good while, think of a way to make it suffer its body to lie quiet in a natural posture. I took the creature and put it into a drop of very well rectified spirit of wine," which is brandy. "This I found would preferentially dispatch, as it were, the animal." This is awesome. Hooke couldn't get the ant to stay still, so he got it drunk. Aside from the images, micrographia is also the first time the term cell was used in reference to microorganisms. Now, while these two advanced microscopy, they didn't apply their findings to medicine. The guy who usually gets credit for that is Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar in the 1600s who loved contagion theory and loved using microscopes. And he looked at everything under the microscope: milk, vinegar, rotten fruits, anything that seemed biological. So when an outbreak of plague came to Rome in 1656, he decided to look at the victims' blood samples under a microscope too, and claimed that he could see little worms in their blood. Unfortunately, this probably didn't happen. The bacteria that causes plague, Yersinia pestis, does look a little like a worm, but there's no way his microscope was powerful enough to actually see one. He was probably seeing clumps of blood cells, and confirmation bias was doing the heavy lifting. Either way, his observation was enough to convince him that plague was caused by germs, and we should do things like quarantine and wear masks to keep from inhaling the plague. He's the kind of guy who gets lost, takes a weird roundabout way to get there, but somehow arrives at the correct destination. Kircher's notes were published in 1658 with this title. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. You've heard my Latin so far, but it translates to something like "Pestilence is Contagion." And it got a little attention for being such a novel idea, but it never went mainstream. And for the rest of the 17th and 18th century, there wasn't a ton of movement on contagion theory, except for physician Marcus Planck, who basically nailed it. In 1762, he published a work called Opera Medicophysica, or Medical Physical Works, where he hypothesized that specific microscopic animalcules cause specific diseases. It's really similar to how we understand disease today. Planck got some praise for this, but just like Fracastoro, he didn't support his hypothesis with great evidence, so the paradigm still didn't shift yet. Now, while all this is going on, scientists were also starting to grapple with the next logical question. Where do these little animalcules come from? Ever since Aristotle, scholars believe that tiny living things came from non-living things through a phenomenon called spontaneous generation. But by the 17th century, a handful of scholars were starting to push back. And in 1668, an Italian physician named Francesco Redi attempted to disprove the idea in a series of experiments published in Experiments on the Generation of Insects. In his experiments, he puts pieces of meat into 6 different jars, puts a lid on half of them, and leaves them out for a few days. The open jars developed maggots, while the closed jars stayed maggot-free. And of course, he got a bunch of pushback from believers in spontaneous generation theory who said that the lids had kept air from entering the jars, which maggots needed to live. So Redi says, okay, and repeated the experiments with gauze instead of solid lids, and got the same results. And while it wasn't an immediate death blow to spontaneous generation theory, it at least sowed seeds of doubt. The 1700s go by, and miasma theory was still the best we had. But then in the 1800s, we see one idea that finally updates miasma theory for the modern era: the idea that all disease is just a microscopic form of fermentation, what they called zymotic theory. It said that everything was made up of super tiny submicroscopic organisms called zymes, from the Greek word for fermentation. These things were even smaller than cells, and everything from humans to plants to rocks had these things in them, kind of like midichlorians. Some believers in the theory thought these zymes were spread from person to person, while some thought that disease-causing zymes were always inside us, but certain conditions like bad hygiene could get them to ferment in the body and cause disease. These zymes didn't multiply in the body like bacteria did, they acted more like a catalyst, which actually gives us our modern use of the term enzyme. But believers in zymotic theory didn't think all diseases spread this way, just certain epidemic diseases. According to a newspaper article in 1877, zymotic diseases are febrile, meaning they cause a fever, they run a definite course, they present during some portion of that course certain distinctive markings on the body, they occur only once in the same person, and they are communicable from person to person by contagion. They classified diseases like smallpox, plague, and cholera as zymotic. Epidemic diseases were getting more common now too, this time thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities. So the pressure was on scientists and public health professionals to figure out what was going on. Starting in 1831, London started getting hit with outbreaks of cholera, which is when a statistician named William Farr got involved. And like other believers of zymotic theory, he believed that cholera was caused by a tiny chemical called cholorine. You'll notice that zyme names follow a predictable naming structure. Influenza was caused by influenzine, syphilis by syphiline, and so on. But still, nobody had found any of these zymes under a microscope yet. So instead, Farr used epidemiological data that he had compiled to reach his conclusions. Specifically, he reasoned that zymes either spread from prior cholera cases or from bad-smelling material, like all the garbage and waste sitting in the River Thames. This new zymotic theory played nicely with the more established miasma theory, and to Farr, it explained why cholera was most concentrated in London's slums and prisons and not the countryside. Densely packed people were breathing in air that was filled with zymotic material. London had a bunch of cholera epidemics over the years, but the most important one happened in 1854. This is the one where Jon Snow made the cholera map, removed the pump handle, and all that. It's a famous story that I already made a video about, link up here, so I don't want to go into too much depth, but the take-home message was that cholera could come from drinking water, not just miasmas. Unfortunately, this is also where the story of miasma starts getting a little murky. By the mid-19th century, miasma theory had morphed into a form that had both old and new school components to it. On one hand, miasma theory was still basically the same thing that Hippocrates had proposed over 2,000 years earlier, but at least its believers had adopted some more nuanced, updated views depending on new information. But this ambiguity wouldn't matter for long, since all the pieces were in place for something to finally replace miasma theory. We knew that disease could pass from person to person, we knew microscopic organisms could get into the human body, and we finally had good microscopes. But scientists were still skeptical. And the process of convincing them that germs cause disease, what we call germ theory, took a lot of experimentation and a lot of fighting. So in the next video, we'll finally tell the story of how germ theory won.